Welcome to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Meskes, a longtime friend and peer of mine. Michael, introduce yourself.
Hi, JD. And yes, long time. I think it's going on 20 years. I've been doing open source as a developer for more than 30 years now, before the term was coined. So that's how we got into it. And now I'm, as we said, wearer of many hats. I started Credativ, run the company for a long time. We did a lot of open source services, and then we merged with Instaclustr, and now part of NetApp.
So you mentioned 30 years of open source, and we can talk about NetApp and Instaclustr later, but I'm a little bit more interested in our backgrounds in open source. You said 30 years. That is actually about how long I've been doing it. My first Linux distribution was SLS. What was yours?
Slackware.
Slackware. So you are just, well, that's what Slackware is based off of, is SLS. And I did move on to Slackware, in fact, when it came out.
Kernel 1.1 something.
Oh, my first kernel, I think, was 0.98 or 99. It was, I remember because it was a big deal when Linus announced Linux 1.0. And actually, I mean, I'm sure the code's been ripped out by now, but I actually have a patch in the kernel from way, way, way back. It was actually submitted via proxy. Do you remember Yggdrasil?
What?
Yggdrasil, Yggradis.
Nope. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I do.
Yeah, they were the first plug-and-play Linux where you'd put in the floppy, and X Windows would actually pop up, and they had a Tickle Talk based installer. I had found that the Sony CDU 31A, I think it was, or 33A. You know, back then CD-ROMs didn't use the ATAPI or IDE interface or anything like that. They used their own proprietary cards. And this was one of the few that was not supported. And I submitted a very small patch to allow it to be detected and supported so that you could boot CD-ROMs and things like that.
But the thing that might interest you or not is I started my open source work before I ever touched a Linux system.
Really? What was your open source work on?
So the system I was working on was a Sun system, Sun OS 4. I have no idea, before before Solaris came out.
So that'd be Sun OS 3, I think. I thought.
Yeah, Sun OS 4 was later renamed Solaris 1.
Yeah, so yeah, Sun OS 3 was the BSD based, and then Sun OS 4 migrated to the System 5 base.
Right. And I was working on that machine at the university and figured I need some software to do X, Y, and Z. I don't really remember what it was. Started looking the internet. I mean, this was before World Wide Web. There were no websites.
Now this was Gopher and Archie.
Yeah, and news groups and FTP servers and the like. I mean, the whole university had like a 2 megabit line for all the students, all the staff, everyone. So
well, back then that was enough, right? Because we didn't have to worry about, one, high res. There was no such thing. And two, everything was text.
Right. There was no graphic.
We expected people to know how to read. What was wrong with us?
Yeah, no idea. Maybe that was before television. Oh wait, no, we did have television back then. Yeah. So
what was it? What did you develop? What did you look for?
No, I downloaded a couple of things, made them work on my Solaris system and so on. And then I remember there was a different protocol called FSP, similar to FTP, but using UDP, I think, was much slower, but nicer to use. And I implemented a couple features there. So on the terminal, you could just search and do command line work on the remote side as well as on the local side.
So to give people some context here, anyone who listens to this and is kind of nerding out because, you know, we're talking about things they frankly don't even know about, because I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure they don't talk about this in comp sci anymore. But Michael and I come from the days when encryption wasn't necessary.
or even available.
Do you remember when GP Cheat came out? I think it was a few years later.
Yeah, I remember talking to Werner when after he wrote it. That was later. PGP, I think, was available. But I became a Debian developer, and I guess we're going to touch the topic of Debian anyway, in something like 94, 95-ish.
Right.
And back then it was send an email to the project lead and say, I would like to join the project and help packaging this or that. And the reply was, here's your account, please change the password. And you log in by Telnet.
Yeah.
There was no
that
page back then.
No, and now, I mean, Debian has key signing parties so they can validate code submissions, and which they should, frankly, because there's a lot of bad actors in the world now, who have access. And frankly, a lot of these bad actors are smarter than the common internet user, which is why people still think they're getting money from Nigerian princes.
Keep in mind, back then, we all used our normal names.
Yes.
Use any whatever avatars, aliases, whatever.
With the exception of IRC.
Yeah. Okay.
IRC enough. Always had the handles, but you're right. We all did use our names. Everybody was who they were. And oddly, I mean, we all tangibly kind of knew of each other too. I mean, I didn't know of you specifically, but I was probably only 3 degrees from you, right?
Yeah, I think somebody did some studies there. I think it was like, worst case, it was like 4. I don't know.
Right.
And then, of course, because we both did Postgres, we ran into each other virtually fairly soon.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things. I mean, I do want to talk about Debian because it's such a stalwart project. And we have some philosophical differences, which I think would be interesting to explore. But first, everybody knows me from Postgres, even though actually I sat on the core of the Linux documentation project for a while. And I covered open source in Linux for the press when Linux World was actually a periodical. But we're both known from the Postgres world, and that's actually where you and I met. So I kind of like to delve into Postgres a bit. What do you think? How did you originally get involved with PostgreSQL?
As I said, I got involved with open source, well, back then free software, while I was at uni, finishing my degrees and then postgrad work. So working on my PhD. And I did the PhD about, well, if you put it not too broadly, it's database science. Okay. I did work on deductive database systems. So you're interested and you really see the movement of free software. You do databases. It's quite logical that you look into free databases. And there were 2 options. MySQL, which wasn't really that free, and also not exactly what I wanted in terms of a real database, and Postgres. So I got stuck with Postgres.
Well, now there's an interesting conversation. So first, just so listeners know, I actually started my Postgres experience actually with Ingres, University of California, Ingres, which is where PostgreSQL gets some of its, where it originates, honestly. And that was very, very brief. That was more for investigation purposes. But then a couple of years later, there was a software called Postgres 95, which predates PostgreSQL. And that's where I started my actual production work, where I started making money and learning and becoming a database, or I should say a Postgres person. I was a DBase person before that.
Interestingly enough, I started, well, database-wise, I started with Ingres, but the proprietary version, not the Berkeley version, but
the actual CA version?
Yes, the actual CA. Back then, I think the company was called Relational Technologies or something. That was what the university had bought.
Oh, interesting.
So I did actually do some programming in Quell.
Oh, wow.
The original. We didn't have SQL back then.
No, that's right.
So it's a similar roots, different way, although Postgres, to be honest, except for Professor Stonebreaker and I think 2 postgrads or something, has no real connection to Ingres. No single line of code was used.
That is correct. That, as far as I know, that is correct. Because a lot of, the current community kind of likes to say that PostgreSQL and Postgres are the same thing. Canonically, that's actually incorrect. It went Ingres Postgres, which was post Ingress, and then it went Postgres 95, and then it went PostgreSQL. And now, because PostgreSQL is quite literally the most terrible name, people have started shortening it over the years to Postgres, but canonically, they're not actually the same thing.
Which still is fine by me. The one thing that really drives me nuts is when people shorten it to PostgreSQL.
So oddly, it's funny you bring that up because I see that less and less now. I still do see it, especially from recruiters who should never be recruiting because they really know nothing about what they're doing. But what I did see that was funny, and I don't think that it was intentional, and I don't think it was out of ignorance. I think it was actually one of these keystroke issues. I think it was a VP of Oracle recently started discussing Postgres, and he wrote a blog about Postgres, but he spelled it with two S's, and or not two S's at the end, so it's POSTGRESS, and he got harangued for this because people were thinking that, oh, not even Oracle can get the name right, because even Oracle is starting to support PostgreSQL in their cloud. But I think the reality of what it was is, I think the mistake was in his mind. He knew he was writing about Postgres, but what his mind did was change it to Progress.
Yeah, agreed.
Right. And it's actually, getting on an argument on Twitter is never productive, but it's one of those things that I thought was kind of funny. But I want to go back. You said something that there's two things you said, and I think it kind of points to possibly our differences in philosophy about free software and open source. You made it a point to say free software because open source didn't exist yet. And then you also said that you had MySQL and PostgreSQL available, and MySQL wasn't quite as free. So first, let's talk about free software versus open source. Where do you sit? I mean, we all call it open source now. That's kind of the term that took over. It's also the politically correct term because of the politically incorrect Richard Stallman. But beyond that ridiculousness, what is where did free software, when did you make the jump, and what are your opinions on the differences?
Yeah, honestly, I don't really care about those small nuances where the terms are different. I think Bruce was right to some extent to coin the term open source, because people were just misunderstanding free. And I don't want to go into Richard Stallman and the whole movement.
No, we don't need to
that's not our topic here. To me nowadays, I don't really care about those small differences. For me, free and open source is the same thing. And I'm fine calling it free and open source, or free libre and open source. Again, we're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, from a practical standpoint, who really cares, right?
Exactly.
But just for our listeners, because most of them are Postgres people, we're not talking about Bruce Momgen. We are talking about Bruce Perens.
Yeah.
Bruce Perens is he's actually one of the founders of Debian. And he coined the term open source. I think it was in '99. And the reason it came about is because, yes, a lot of people, even to this day, if you say free software, people kind of think about it as in, oh, you mean I can download it and use it for free? And those things do exist. But when we talk about free software, we are talking about free as in liberty free, where we have access to the code and we can do pretty much whatever we want with it, depending on what the license says.
It even goes further than just you can download it for free. I mean, people, and I actually was on the receiving line of a phone call where some government entity actually called us. Yeah, the printer didn't work and they used free software for it. Somebody had to come and fix it. And I was like, okay, fair enough. Do you want to send me an order? You want to know my rates? How do we do the commercial side of things? And they were like flabbergasted. What do you mean commercial side? Why do we have to pay? It's free. They literally expected us to put somebody in a car, drive for an hour and a half, fix their problem, go back, and everything's for free.
Now, I never ran into that.
I did.
Now, what I did run into, because they're not so popular now, at least where I am, but user groups where you would go and chat with like-minded individuals about open source and Linux. I did run into a situation where I helped an individual. Oddly enough, it was only a few years ago, a couple, maybe 4 years ago. And I was helping him with cups. And cups is the Unix printing system that Mac OS uses and Linux uses. And I found it hilarious because I'm an unintended expert on cups because I wrote some articles on it a long time ago. And I also wrote, or I was co-author of a digital, paperless system that utilized cups at its core. And this guy was having problems because he switched his printer and he couldn't figure out how to get his new printer to work. And I'm here in a Linux user group, and nobody knew how to even like set up a printer. Now, I mean, that's a sign of the times, right? Most people don't use printers anymore. But it was kind of funny because I helped him, and then he expected me to do a lot more. Right. I'm like, no offense, man. I got your printer to work. I'm a professional. I'm $250 an hour. How would you like me to proceed?
Yeah.
And he was like, but this is free. I'm like, no. Now if you'd said, I'll buy you a beer, can you help me some more? That's a different discussion. But so I mean, we got the free software and we got the open source, and there was definitely some mentality breaks there because people just didn't understand how it worked. And Bruce Parents came about, and open source was kind of coined originally as a more, I don't want to say business, but a more commercial name that was more palatable, that people could understand and make sense of. It was also unique in comparison to, say, shared source or shareware, those types of things. So we discussed that. Now, the next thing here, though, this is where I'm kind of interested. You said MySQL was not as free as PostgreSQL. I'd like you to elaborate.
The thing with MySQL back then was they were running under dual license. So you can use it for your private stuff, for university stuff, and then it's licensed GPL. Great. But because they were selling it, they needed to have a different license. I forgot what the name of the license was. And because they had to be able to do different license or put different licenses on the same code, they weren't able to accept patches.
Unless
they
you
had to do
did they not have
did
they not have contributor agreements back then?
Nope.
They
literally rejected patches and re-implemented the features themselves. And even with contributor agreements, it's not that easy. It's I guess the legal system or the legal framework is different, especially when those developers are from different legal systems. So the jurisdiction is different. The whole setup is different over here than it is in your place. And I signed those documents where I just transfer my copyright to, let's say, the Free Software Foundation. Technically, that's not possible where I live. So it's a different setup. And I'm not sure if companies really should go or do go into that risky area. Now, Postgres was BSD license and still is, what kind of?
No, it is.
It is.
They call it the Postgres license.
Exactly. It's still the same license, essentially. So you could do with it whatever you wanted. Although deep down, I prefer the GPL, to be honest. And that's probably the part you want to get to.
Yeah, that's our philosophical difference. And actually, over my philosophy, let's say, and it has, I don't want to say matured, but it's certainly changing over time. And a good part of that is because of the cloud. But yes, I don't, generally speaking, prefer the GPL. I actually prefer the LGPL, and I've always preferred the LGPL, even over BSD. And the reason is the LGPL allows people to close source, therefore not violating their freedoms. But it requires that any changes they make must be made available. And that's important. A lot of people don't realize that there are two, the GPL and LGPL worked together in concert to make the dominant operating system of the world possible. And no, I'm not talking about Windows, I'm talking about Linux. There is no argument that Linux would be nowhere where it is today if it was BSD licensed. Just look at FreeBSD, which is an excellent operating system, but largely, I would say, didn't make it where it needed to be because of its license. However, on the flip side, Linux also wouldn't be as anywhere near where it is today without the LGPL, and that is because glibc is LGPL, and it allows the linking of proprietary software to Linux, meaning Android exists because of the LGPL. The ability to run Steam and Civilization 6 on Linux is because of the LGPL.
Again, I completely agree on that account. The issue I see, and I've seen over the years and decades, is a project like Linux kernel, that is GPL/LGPL, gets by without a lot of rules. They have rules for development and stuff, but not about commercial interest. And a lot of companies bought into it, and they just share resources. Now, in projects that are BSD license, you usually look at the Apache Foundation or whatnot, you have a lot of regulations. You cannot do this, you have to do that, and so on. Just because the license, sure, gives you more freedom in terms of you can do whatever you want, you can just close source your changes and so on, but it makes cooperating more difficult.
So now that I find that interesting, because I think it would depend on, I think there's a perspective issue here, and I'll give you two points to this. Now, I agree with you about the Apache Foundation, right? Because one of the issues that you have is it's difficult to cooperate on a commercial level when there's an interest involved that allows, let's say, an advantage, right? The great thing about GPL is that it doesn't matter if IBM is contributing, I'm contributing, or Google is contributing. There's no advantage except for the mutual advantage.
Right.
Whereas with BSD, and you see this with, say, Enterprise DB. Now, I'm not knocking Enterprise DB. They are a great PostgreSQL contributor. They've been around a long time. But they have key technologies that could drive PostgreSQL forth in a really good way. For example, BDR, that they keep close to chest, that they do not open source. And that's because it provides a business key advantage and it's not mutual, right? Whereas with Debian, now this is where I want to explore on this a little bit. So Apache has specific rules. You want to participate in an Apache project for, Apache is a BSD style license, and these are the specific rules you follow. There's advantages to that. But Debian is all about free software. It's all about the GPL. And although there is certainly a mutual benefit to running Debian, and there are those that benefit from it, for example, Ubuntu, they have a different overhead in that my understanding is that they are beyond bureaucratic. I mean, you open bureaucratic in the dictionary or in Wikipedia, and there should be the Debian logo.
I wouldn't go that far. There is this is a completely different topic. I mean, the one thing with Debian is that it doesn't have a structure. It's like grassroots democracy, if you want to say so. So the project lead is a project lead. I mean, it's not a position to make any decisions. So you have to build in some structure. I mean, we're talking more than 1,000 developers, so you have to have some sort of structure. But from the technical perspective, I think the issue with a license, it really stands. And I remember talking to some European manager from a well-known, well, let's say Postgres company way back when, who literally told me, we are not giving anything back. We just take what the community gives us to be quicker to market, to get more revenue. I was like, you got to be kidding me. You should know that I'm one of the developers you're taking from and not contributing back. Needless to say, that guy survived for like a couple of months after the higher ups learned about what he said. That's not the way cooperation works. And the whole open source movement works because people are cooperating.
That's true.
It cannot work if you're working against each other. And fortunately for us, for everyone, people found that out. I mean, the operating system people were more or less the first, but nowadays you see car makers contribute to some common operating system for the sat nav and the multimedia and whatnot, because nobody buys a car because it has a better operating system. You might
Right.
buy it because your sat nav has a better user interface, maybe, but not because the layer below the operating system is better. Nobody will recognize that. So everything that's commodity can be done together, and we get a much better quality of software.
Very good point. And that'll allow me to roll back to what we need to talk about with PostgreSQL. We know how you originally got involved.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the largest challenge to PostgreSQL development is?
That is a good question, and I don't think I can really answer that now because I've been so far out of touch for recent months or year and a half because of too much work and too much other stuff going on.
Okay, so
to
what?
really go into details.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask this then. You and I both used to be deeply involved in PostgreSQL.org. Now
Right.
we can, there's, the PostgreSQL community is far beyond PostgreSQL.org now. I mean, PostgreSQL.org is a development organization. But let me ask this, and I hope that you'll answer it. What caused you to pull back from it? Because I remember the days when you and I would go back and forth, trying to figure out the best solution to X problem on the mailing list, which is where the collaboration took place at the time. And there was a moment, and I don't know what moment it was or what time, or it was a series of moments where you and I, and not at the same time, but we pulled out of that. What caused you to pull out of it? And I specifically asked you because you were, I don't know if you still are, but for a long time, even after you pulled back, you were still maintained as a committer because of ECPG.
I'm still a committer, but I haven't touched the source code in quite a while. I try to stay on top of the ECPG topics unless somebody else takes care of it, and then I still do some double checking for the patches just to make sure. I think, and that holds for all communities. Over the years, you see issues coming up in communities. Sometimes people are just trying to do stuff for their own advantage. And I've seen this in like open source trade organizations, in open source communities, no matter if they are like real communities or run by companies, somebody keeps trying to get some personal advantage out of it. But usually it's like a wave, it goes up and down. So in all honesty, I have not left Postgres.org because of some of that. I just backed down a little bit because of my workload.
Fair enough. Okay, so you're not sure what the largest challenge is, and I get that. I mean, I don't know what it is either. I don't participate in the inner circle anymore. It just was no longer productive for me.
But what I can tell you is, and you mentioned some of the tools EDB has, some of the technologies EDB has.
Yes.
The same could probably be said about some other companies. And it's public. I mean, I've been on stage talking about that. I don't like the idea that we as a broader community doing tools in different ways instead of just combining the resources. We don't need like a dozen different backup tools. It doesn't make sense. But because of some marketing constraints, or I have no idea why, people keep doing that.
Well, now hold on. I'm going to disagree with you on this. And let me ask you this. We don't need a dozen different Linux desktops or distributions either.
Agreed.
But there are many that are successful because they solve a problem in a way that speaks to who the user is, right? Go ahead.
You mentioned Ubuntu.
Correct.
When we had briefly touched Debian before. There has been a long discussion with Mark before Shuttleworth, before he
Yeah.
started Ubuntu. And to the day, I still stick to my point that we all would have been better off had he put those resources into Debian instead of creating essentially a fork.
I would absolutely 100% agree with you, but there is no way that he could have done so and produced the same productive result.
That I do not agree with.
Well, I'll give you an example. This laptop is actually, I don't think I'm on the current Dell XPS 13 Plus, which I just bought for myself. Just brief sidebar, the most beautiful laptop I've ever owned. This is the first time I've ever bought myself a top of the line laptop, and I love it. But I've had laptops in the other laptops, Asus, Acers, things like that in the past. And here's the difference. More than once, when I was still a geek in the terminal, I have tried to fire up Debian to have it fail, and I fired up Ubuntu to have it work.
Oh yeah,
that's the key difference. That is the very key difference about Ubuntu, is that it just works for a level of population that is not the core Debian demographic.
A lot of that technology actually moved back to Debian, and nowadays a lot of those maintainer teams, like the kernel is probably the most well-known one, work very closely together.
Well, and that's fantastic. I mean, I am talking about, let's say a decade ago, if not more.
But still, he could have done they could have done the different installer and just put it alongside the old one. Maybe Debian would have just accepted the new installer. There is room in Debian just to create a new installer, for example. I still believe it would have been better. Nowadays, it doesn't make a huge difference because there is this cooperation going on and collaboration going on between those distributions. I don't think you need to fork it. But still, yes, there might be some edge cases. Again, but at Linux distribution, or the use cases for Linux distribution are much bigger. There are many more than a backup tool. And I use the backup tool on purpose because it just has a very small and narrowly defined purpose. Back up the data and be able to restore the data. That's it. There are only so many things you can do with a backup tool.
Well, now see, I'm going to disagree with you there too, because while you're correct that is let's call it the problem we're solving. The problem we're solving with a backup tool is we need to be able to back up our data and restore our data. PG-based backup, as well as PG dump all, solve those problems. PG-based backup and PG dump and dump all do it very poorly. That's why you get PG backrest, which command prompt and myself, I consider it the industry standard. There are other tools out there, but in terms of best practices, I think it provides the most mature feature set, as well as is on par with what you would expect from an enterprise class backup tool. But there's also like PG Barman, which a lot of people use. I don't particularly care for it, but that doesn't mean it's not a usable product. And they're all scratching an itch for a particular vein of people that need to solve certain problems. That's why I agree with you on this.
PG dump is a bad example because that's just historic. Yes, I agree that some tools solve a specific edge and others solve a different edge, but it doesn't mean we cannot combine those into one tool and solve all the edges.
So I'm going to disagree with you again. And now, is the question, should we? Yes, I agree with you. But when you say PG dump is a bad example because it's historical, as someone who's been in the community as long as I have, and you have together, you and I both know that we have more than once tried to put resources behind fixing that historical problem, only to be told no. And PG based backup is a perfect example of a tool that does not solve the problem for modern data sets. I mean, when you have core developers who say, I don't care how long a backup takes, so we don't need multi-threading on PG based backup, That's a vast misunderstanding of the current workloads that PostgreSQL is working on. And that is why we end up in a scenario where, say, PG back REST is taking over the market for backups.
Yeah, and so I'm fine with something taking over. I mean, we both are old enough in open source that you probably have used Sendmail before, as
Oh
did
yeah,
I.
long time.
And then Postfix came around, and nobody using Sendmail anymore. I'm not saying we cannot do it better. I mean, in some areas, it's much easier to start from scratch and build something that's much better. That's not the point. The point is that people are constantly putting resources into improving one tool when there's already another that solves the problem much better, instead of adding those few missing bits and pieces to the better one.
So I agree with. I do agree with that. You know, philosophically and historically, PostgreSQL has always been about let the external tools handle this. We're going to provide the best kernel, essentially.
Yeah.
So I do get where you're coming from there. And I certainly do respect. Let me, you mentioned not just Enterprise DB. I need to say here, I wasn't picking on Enterprise DB. The reason I picked Enterprise DB specifically is because they are a closed source vendor who contributes a great deal to Postgres, and the community as a whole could benefit from some of their specific tools if they opened them. Now, on the other hand, it's not that I don't understand why they don't open them, right? There are very good reasons why they don't open them. It's just, I don't want people to think I'm picking on EDB, because I'm not. There are other people that I think Michael and I will both agree that we can pick on here shortly. But I want to kind of approach this Postgres problem a little bit. This is something, and granted, to our listeners, Michael and I do not directly contribute all that much to .org, PostgreSQL.org anymore. We do so in a tertiary fashion, you know, obviously through People Postgres Data or PostgresConf, Postgres World. Michael speaks a lot on these topics. And as he mentioned, he's a committer to ECPG for PostgreSQL. But, you know, common themes when I speak with new and old Postgres developers or former developers, one of them is, how do we attract new developers to Postgres? And I'm curious, Michael, if you have any opinion on, you know, what can we do to help more people contribute to Postgres on, you know, for the good of the project, for the good of the kernel, that kind of thing?
That is actually one of the trickiest question in Postgres, but also in a lot of areas in open source. When we started, it was fairly easy. You get into it, you look at the software, you can understand what's going on. But nowadays, all software has become so complex that it's just not as straightforward anymore. People need a lot of time to work themselves up to a certain point to learn how to really understand the issues. There is not much low-hanging fruit anymore in any open source project that has a certain amount of developers. And if you want to tackle a bigger issue, well, good luck with that. I mean, even back then, the original reason I started working on Postgres wasn't to develop a precompiler. I wanted to put my research into it, and that was mostly about recursive queries in databases. Nowadays, we have recursive queries, but not a single line of code was written by me. That's just the way life threw me a curveball, essentially. I got into Postgres, and then I got into a job. I needed a precompiler, so I found something and improved it until it was really usable. I got stuck with it and lost the time to do all the recursive query stuff. Because I couldn't just go in and say, I got a couple hours here and there to develop my recursive queries. That was such a big project. I just didn't find the time to tackle it.
No, I agree with you on a certain level. Certainly, if you are a new developer, unless you're already, I mean, let's say a former DB2 engineer who is joining Postgres and they have the vast database internals knowledge to at least translate their knowledge and skills into something new. I agree with you that the lift is very heavy. But there are plenty of places where the lift is not heavy within the projects. Docs is or I should say the lift isn't heavy to at least attempt to contribute. But there, obviously, the bureaucracy of how PostgreSQL does development, there is a heavy lift. But docs is an example, or there's new utilities. A good example is PG test sync, right? And I don't want to discount the effort that was made on that utility, because it is a great utility, and it used to be, I think it was called test osync or something like that in the source tree, and you could do it to do testing of the fsync call on various operating systems. And now it's now it's actually deployed when you install Postgres as PG test sync for diagnostic purposes. And I don't want to take away from the value of that utility, because frankly, it's surprising to me how much of little utility, which, without being disrespectful, a second-year computer scientist could have wrote, is so demonstrably useful to the community as a whole. So I think that there is room. PG dump all. There's room there. There's room in PG base backup. All of these are not heavy lift type scenarios to contribute to.
Yeah, but I mean, you bring up a new tool. There's a reason why this is a new tool, probably because nobody ever thought about writing something like that.
Well, no, the tool existed. It just existed as a diagnostic tool within the source tree.
Right. But somebody came up with the idea, and then it wasn't much work. I agree. I'll give you that. Docs are not exactly a good example, because show me a developer who likes to write or update docs.
Oh no, I don't disagree. I mean, no, most developers don't. I was just stating there are places that are relatively low-hanging fruit to contribute to Postgres. However, there's challenges in doing that are beyond submitting a patch, right? And those are the challenges I was wondering if you had an opinion on. If not, that's cool, right?
I'm not sure if there's such a big challenge if you want to submit a patch for docs. I've seen one just last week or week before last, but Bruce Momgen this time already took care of it and fixed it, so and committed it. Somebody just noticed, oh, this option hasn't been documented, and send a patch. So that's fairly easy. And now, if the patches get bigger or have more side effects, I get the point that we need to be more formal about it. Do I really like the process? I'm not sure. Is the process really mature? Probably not. But we need something. We cannot just throw patches in and see how it goes.
No, certainly not. And I wasn't referring to quality control, right? Which I think Postgres, in terms of the patch process, I would say that Postgres is probably exhaustive when it comes to quality control, to the point where people are like, come on, guys, give me a break. Even the patches that I did years and years ago to PSQL, even after the patches were accepted, it went through another round because somebody else looked at them and decided they didn't particularly like how it worked. And so it can be exhaustive, but that's not actually what I was referring to. I think I would agree with this statement that of open source projects, and especially databases, and certainly in comparison to any closed source software, the quality control of PostgreSQL is second to none. And I have no problem stating that. I just feel that I think culturally PostgreSQL is behind the times in terms of how to produce productive, efficient, and collaborative development. But I think that, I don't know that we need to get into that per se, but I mean, I'm certainly willing to listen to your opinion on that.
I mean, you might be up to something there. I mean, the process is still the same process, except for some twitches that we had back in the 90s.
Right.
The world has changed, technology has changed, the way software is developed has changed. but I have no idea how to just implement that in the Postgres space or any other open source project. I mean, there are projects that work more in an agile way, more in a, I don't know, use the modern technologies, CI/CD and whatnot. Others do it less. I give you that, but also I think there is no piece of software that has to be that careful with patches as a database. I mean, this is the core of everything. And if we put patches in there that don't work, and there is some history, I remember somebody putting patches out. I mean, this was on the commercial side and more of a commercial product, giving them their customers a patch that has been tested all over the place. Well, they later found out nobody had tested it except the developer.
I know exactly who you're talking about, but we're not going to say the name.
And it just destroyed all their data, everything gone. So yeah, I'm not going to blame anyone on it, and I only know one side of the story. So be careful with believing everything. But still, that kind of scenario is something we cannot afford to have. Very simple.
No, I agree with that. And you know, it used to be for a while. There was a brief window when I was like, "Damn it, get over yourself, move to GitHub." There was a brief window, and then I thought about it. And honestly, I mean, don't get me wrong, we use GitHub. It's a great service. It's very good at what it does. I'm not arguing about the quality of GitHub. But years ago, I was a director for software in the public interest. And we got together for a board meeting in person. It was like one of the first board meetings in person ever for software in the public interest. And we were in New York, and we were in the offices of the Software Conservancy or Software Freedom Law Center, one or the other. I think they're one and the same at the time. I don't remember. And I was sitting there, and it doesn't matter who said it, but he was the president of SPI at the time. And he sat there and he sat back and he put his hands behind his head and he said, "Well, guys, we won." And the reference was open source. And I interjected. I said, "What exactly have we won? We haven't won anything. The number one enemy to open source is GitHub." And why is that? People will guffaw if they hear this. No, GitHub is a great supporter of open source. Can I download GitHub source? No, I can't. So there's a philosophical thing there. The current generation, let's be honest, the current generation of people coming up, the people that think Slack is a good thing, you know, they don't have those philosophical hills to die on, as far as I can tell. I mean, I'm sure there's some, but as a general rule, they're more interested in just developing the software, and they want simple tools to do so and simple tools to collaborate. And that's why Slack is advantageous, and that's why GitHub is advantageous. And it's why GitLab, as awesome as GitLab is, doesn't have the foothold that, say, GitHub does, because GitLab is an open source commercial product kind of in the fringes. And it's certainly why the GNU version has never taken off. But GitHub, it represents something, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I think you'll agree with the line of thought. I think it represents the commercialization, the finalization of this movement. Because what you've done, and there's another part of this in here, what we've done is provided a cloud service for open source development that sets the rules for that in a development. And you can see that now because, you know, you'll see GitHub suddenly remove the ability for someone to you know, collaborate because of some Justice Department memo that actually has nothing to do with the developer, but had to do with some technology that he offered to contribute to. Right. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not arguing the validity of jurisdiction or the Justice Department or anything like that. They obviously, GitHub is a commercial enterprise, and therefore they're going to have to take care of whatever the Justice Department says to continue to do business. But it is the antithesis of what free software and open source originally was. We're no longer collaborating in communities, we're collaborating in portals. And we're using cloud services that we don't own, that we can't deploy, that we can't modify, that we can't improve to work on software. What are your thoughts there, Michael?
That's certainly a point. You certainly got a point there. And we used other services before, and some of them have more or less gone away. So there is a point in just hosting your own Git version. Hosting your own Git archive and you're fine. You don't have all the bells and whistles, fair enough, but at least everything is your own. Yes, you can still keep your source code, but if your whole development focuses on some features that GitHub or any other services give you, and then the company behind the service decides to take that one away, you're screwed.
That is
And
correct.
As you said, this is exactly the opposite of what open source should be.
So, we mentioned cloud, and you mentioned, other players in the Postgres space who, are closed source. I think that it's important. In fact, I'm in the process of, there's a blog that I wrote called PostgreSQL Minimum Requirements. I wrote it like 15, 16 years ago or something like that. And it actually, it comes up as like number 2 and 3 or 3 on Google if you Google it. And it's so out of date, right? And when I found this out, I'm like, God, I got to update this article. So I'm in the process of updating that. And I'm talking about Postgres minimum requirements for production use, not development, not staging, not screwing around. I'm talking about, making sure your system is going to work. And one of the things I say in this article is that I am not talking about RDS. I'm not talking about AlloyDB. I'm not talking about NeonDB. I'm not talking about Greenplum. I'm not talking about any of those, not Aurora, none. And the reason is they are not PostgreSQL. Now, I can write an article on best practices to deploy Aurora for PostgreSQL. Okay, I can write that article. But it's not PostgreSQL. Aurora is not PostgreSQL. And I think that is something that is lost on the current generation of developers. We'll get people that come into the Slack channel. We'll get people that come into the People Postgres Data Discord channel. They're like, well, I'm running Aurora and I need this question answered about PostgreSQL. And, I apologize to my producer in advance, but I'm not trying to be a dick about this, but you're not running PostgreSQL. Aurora is closed source, and it is different. The way it handles writes and the wall writer is architecturally different, not just tuned differently. It is architecturally different. Their planner is different. There are other things that work just differently than normal PostgreSQL, not the least of which is that they control what you can and cannot do with PostgreSQL, with their version, their fork of PostgreSQL. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. There is a demand for it, but it, to me, is the antithesis of what open source is supposed to be.
The interesting question there is, will that solution or will that way of forking, technically it's kind of forking because they closed it and whatever, because it's no longer open source, but will forking win, or will the other solutions win that do exist, that use clear Postgres without any changes and offer it as a service?
So I'll be honest with you, and maybe it's because I'm getting old. I mean, you're older than I am, so you'll probably appreciate this. I think in the end, money wins. I think that's what it boils down to. You can see that I'm not going to say who, but let's remember that a great Amazon has a very particular culture. I've known people that have moved to Amazon, who have gone to Amazon, for example, for the money, who are no longer there because they couldn't handle the culture. That doesn't mean the culture's bad. It's just a different culture. And clearly Amazon is offering, opportunity and capabilities and benefits and all that are beyond just money. And they've got a lot of employees and a lot of them are happy. So if you're for those who are listening, they're like, Amazon bad, Amazon bad. Well, for about 1.5 million people, Amazon ain't that bad. So you might want to think about that a little bit.
Yeah, but the question is, at the end of the day, money wins. Fair enough. But what money? The money that is invested into the software? I don't think I agree with that one.
No,
The
I'm
money
talking
that
about
you can get, the ROI you get from the software, the usage you get from the software. I mean, the whole open source movement where we stand right now shows that the winner is not the one who puts the most money into development, but who uses the software the best and who gives their customers, their users, the best experience. And
well,
the
I would
jury is
agree with that
still out
entirely.
on who wins the database as a service thing. The jury is still out, and there are offerings. Yes, I do work for a company that does offer standard Postgres as a service, but independent of that, I strongly believe that the winner will be the one that's more open, that's closer to the real Postgres code. Eventually, the forks will die off because they will take too much effort to keep afloat, to keep on top of things. So the better way, if you ask me, the better way is make sure that everything goes through the open source pieces, because that's the future. And we have proven that, well, for the last 30 years. The whole movement shows that this is the better way.
So yes and no. So I think that there is absolutely an argument for contributing things back. I mean, and even Amazon agrees with this. You contribute things back that are going to be of universal benefit, that you don't want to necessarily have to maintain, that possibly you're utilitarian or just, it just makes sense. There are times when that is the case, hands down. Okay. But especially with Postgres, actually, this is, with PostgreSQL, this is actually, your argument actually starts to fall down with PostgreSQL specifically. I agree with you if we're talking about Nginx, or if we're talking about the Linux kernel, or if we're talking about, even Debian, right? Because if you contribute to Debian, it will eventually end up upstream into, say, Ubuntu or any of the dozen derivatives of Ubuntu. But with PostgreSQL, there's a unique thing that has happened because of its development culture. PostgreSQL takes the mindset that we are developing the most advanced open source relational database as a kernel. Now, what does that mean? It means that we provide interfaces for extensions, for being able to write our own storage engines, to be able to write our own index types, to be able to write our own languages. So there's absolutely a benefit to contributing to making those things, like for Amazon or Google or Microsoft, to contributing to make those things better. Where there's not a benefit, and I'm only picking on the cloud vendors specifically because every single one of the cloud vendors has a fork of PostgreSQL that people think is PostgreSQL that is not PostgreSQL. Okay, I'm not saying the cloud isn't valuable. I make a ton of money off of the cloud. Thank you, cloud providers, so making it so that I don't have to pay for the hardware. Okay, I'm not. That's not the argument. But what I am saying is that there is zero benefit for Amazon, or let's take Google or Microsoft Azure, because they all did it. They all made their own version of Aurora, right? Amazon was first. Google has AlloyDB and Microsoft has Azure, the way they handle things. They all made their own version that has not been contributed back. Why? Because they don't have to. Because it's not more expensive for them to maintain it, because PostgreSQL wouldn't accept it anyway. Now, where I do think you have an argument is if you take someone like Timescale. Now, they have a great piece of software, but their piece of software, in order to specifically improve, they have to contribute to PostgreSQL, because PostgreSQL as a kernel eventually is going to dwarf them in feature set. It's going to, you can already do things in PostgreSQL that compete directly with Timescale. The only advantage to Timescale is that they've put the pretty wrapper on it, so it's easier. Now, I'm not knocking Timescale. They really do make a great product, but they have to keep up with the PostgreSQL code specifically, right? Otherwise, they start to fall behind and their product is no longer as useful because all of a sudden PostgreSQL does have continuous aggregates or does have auto partitioning or whatever the case may be. But I seriously doubt that PostgreSQL is ever going to implement networked wall storage. It doesn't make sense for them to do so. Do you see what I'm saying? Where certain things about giving back make sense, but others don't?
Yeah, I get your point. Honestly, I'm not sure if Microsoft really has a version that is different from stock Postgres. The last
they
time I
do.
checked, it could be the last time I checked, that was a while ago, then they were running stock Postgres. But I get the point of having to add or remove or change some pieces to make it work better in their cloud. I get that. And it doesn't make sense for them to contribute that one back, because why would the project have an open source piece to make sure that Postgres runs better on Google and only Google contributes to it and only Google is interested in, because nobody else can use those features anyway? I get that. That part is true. But the goal has to be to keep that part as small as possible. And only use it for those bits and pieces that you definitely need to integrate into whatever cloud you have, but not on the additional feature set. And I honestly believe if we get it, well, people to collaborate on those additional feature set, they will pass that one company that tries to do it all themselves pretty quickly.
Oh, I don't disagree with that. If we could find a way to get those feature sets contributed and the core community, the .org community, would be willing to accept them and work in a manner that was more culturally fitting, I would agree with that. Just real quick on the Microsoft thing, from the user experience and from, say, the planner and so on and so forth, I can't speak to whether or not Microsoft has changed anything. Maybe they didn't, but I know for a fact they changed the way they handle storage, which is why I referenced them. Okay. But you are correct. I mean, in comparison to, say, Amazon Aurora is just different, right? It's so.
But the storage example, I mean, Amazon still has RDS.
Yes.
There are different ways. The storage piece I get. I mean, it's a different infrastructure, and if you want to use the existing infrastructure, you need to have a storage layer that is fine-tuned towards that infrastructure. But it doesn't make sense to put this into a wider circulation because nobody else has that infrastructure.
That's true. I mean, if you look at, say, NeonDB, I don't know if you've looked at them at all. They're actually trying to build an open source Aurora, or AlloyDB. I shouldn't point just to Aurora. And it's an interesting project. And they are trying to use, your standard infrastructure. You put, 10 gigabit or whatever connections between servers, and you're able to deploy an Aurora-like instance that has fast branching and things like that. It's pretty cool. That being said, we're actually a little bit far in time here, and we've kind of been going on and on about open source, which I think is important. And so let me ask this, because I think you and I, as long as we've known each other, we could probably talk for another 3 hours and still not solve the world's problems. Even as smart as you and I are. Right. But let me ask this: what, in your opinion, as someone who has been in the community at least as long as I have, and who is a professional in the enterprise space, what is the largest or the biggest risk to PostgreSQL in the current time?
I'm not sure I can say much about the current time, but I think in general, the biggest risk is exactly what we've been talking about. That somebody takes over and creates something that they claim is Postgres, but it's not.
You mean like hiring all the brain share or brain trust?
Yeah, I mean, you and I, we've both seen enough cases where, like, marketing said our product Postgres. I've had people on the phone, again, personally, who ask me how it is possible that we as a company support company X, Y, or Z's product named Postgres. And you got to explain to them, no, it's not their product. Yeah, that's what they told me. Yeah, but it's not true.
Right.
Now, if somebody were able to like hire everyone and really get all the resources under one roof and then take over and close source it, that to me is a big risk. And again, we're coming back down to BSD license. They could do it. We would then have to fork and work on the older versions. And there are a lot of examples in the open source world as a whole where projects didn't really survive that step.
It's interesting you bring that up. You're not wrong. I mean, obviously, I don't think Oracle's a risk because too many people that love Postgres just hate Oracle. But I think there are other companies that are a risk. I think that we see larger companies absorbing our talent. And the reality is, even if a corporation, if they say, yes, you're going to be able to contribute back, the answer is yes, you'll be able to contribute back as long as it is beneficial to the company. Right. So there is a concern there. To me,
it has to be beneficial for the company. Unfortunately, a lot of companies don't understand open source. They don't see their benefits.
No, I agree with that. Even the larger companies who profess to understand it, I don't think that they do.
A lot of companies don't. That's the issue. And the other big issue we have is we lack talent. We don't attract enough people to get into the community. I mean, you mentioned us being old. I mean, yes, I'm older than you, but some of the core developers are even older.
Oh, yeah, hands down.
At some point, us will not be there. I mean, we will not be able to do any more development, or we just lose interest because, I don't know. Some young guys have to take over.
I think, and I think that's where I've been trying to get this whole conversation, is that we have a cultural issue within PostgreSQL.org. Whether we like it or not, Michael, our ability to adapt to new methods is not as good as it was when we were in our 30s. That's just the fact of getting older.
Right.
And it is a scientific fact. This is not my personal opinion. And if you look at a lot of the developers in our community, they are all, we all get older, but they are either older than us or very close to our age, which means they do not adapt to cultural change as easily. And when I say culture, I'm not talking about what you would see in the press. I'm talking about core inner learnings of how one reacts to the world, right? We all grew up in a certain way. And what that means is culturally, as awesome as our technology is, our community is not necessarily at the forefront of being inviting to people that would want to participate. In fact, I would argue that in many ways it's hostile. Now, there are tertiary or secondary communities that are either directly or indirectly linked to PostgreSQL that are very friendly and very inclusive and have adapted well to new cultures and new perspectives. But the core community, the .org community, it's old-fashioned. That's what it boils down to. It is something that you can't just join and enjoy anymore because it doesn't reflect a younger generation, a brilliant younger generation's way of doing things. And that's not going to get any better because the leadership, and I'm not talking about core specifically, I'm talking about when you think of who are people that are in the know, who do you want to talk to when you're at a conference, that type of thing. We're all getting old. And we don't necessarily,
The risk here is, I absolutely agree, we're all getting old, and the risk is that we don't see that we're still trying to go the old ways and don't really recognize the new ones. Agreed. I remember an old movie where an old teacher once said to a younger one, "You young guys, you always think you have better ways of doing it. And you also do it better than us." I guess that's the way it is. The young generation comes up with different ideas. They want to do things differently. And most of the time, this is exactly what is needed. They don't have to repeat what we did our whole life.
No, I agree. I mean, that's called progress, right?
Right. Not sometimes it's the opposite, but hey.
No, agreed. Sometimes it reverts, and there are certainly, if we go beyond Postgres and talk about society in general right now, there are certain places I think you and I would absolutely agree that we're bashing our head against the table saying, what in the hell?
Exactly.
But it's funny you say that. As I close this up, and I don't know the answer to this, but I would like our listeners, especially people who, let's call it 45 plus, right? And let's just think about it. Anyone who's 45 plus, I want to know how old the engineer that came up with the pull request was, because it's brilliant. It is a brilliant way to collaborate. It is a brilliant way to work with Git. It's I think the pull request is actually what makes GitHub the most, or it got the foothold that it does now. With that, Michael, thank you very much for participating. I'd actually like to have you on again, because this is, we didn't even touch on the other, 60 bullet points we have in this outline. But I think we had a really great conversation about open source, and I think it's an important topic for people to understand, because I don't think the modern generation, the current generation, I don't think they get it. And I'm not saying that they're right, but beyond anything, you and I think would agree that knowledge is power, and having them have that knowledge so that they can make knowledgeable decisions about their critical, points in life, I think that's valuable.
Thanks for having me, JD, and I would love it to come on again.
Oh, you are very welcome. Thank you again. And with that, this has been More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it.